Welcome. I'm Jessica Tietjen, and this is the Evolving to Exceptional podcast, where we talk about reaching peak performance in our workplaces, homes, and communities so that we can live our best life possible, an exceptional life. I want to welcome everybody back to this week's episode of Evolving to Exceptional. We have another senior HR leader with us as our guest today, Trista Stahr. She is going to be talking to us about communication and some of the challenges that come with communication, as well as highlighting some of her really unique background and experience with respect to HR and leadership in general that has equipped her and provided her just a tremendous variety of perspectives and thoughts on some of the most common people and HR related challenges. Before we get into kind of the meat of our conversation, Trista, I want to give you a chance to just introduce yourself to our audience a little bit. Tell us just a little bit about your background, your experience, and why it is that you do what you do. How it is that you ended up in senior people focused role, and yeah, anything else you want to add or share.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Jessica. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to this discussion and conversation. My journey actually started when I was 15 years old, and my very first job was actually working at McDonald. I think I learned everything I needed to know about people interacting with people at that age and customer care and urgency. And I think a lot of the foundation of who I am today, quite frankly, came from that experience. And I carry that with me and think about that in every role that I've had since then. I actually landed in my very first HR job, my first HR role with Cushman Wakefield. Then it was Colliers Shirley Martin Tucker. And I really fell into it. I felt a connection with my old boss, Lisa. She gave me this opportunity, and I started as an HR assistant, filing background checks, but really felt a passion around talent acquisition. I loved going to career fairs. I loved talking to people. I loved giving them a chance and an opportunity and to change their life. And so I really started to have that passion with talent acquisition, ended up leading talent acquisition when I left there. But also, I really knew that I wanted that business partner experience. And I wanted to experience working at a well known best place to work here in St. Louis. So when Merritt's called me, I knew that was the place for me. I was very excited. They are known for their culture. They are known for their focus on employee engagement. They sell it through the motivation program. They deliver the trip. And it was truly an exceptional experience. They truly cared about their people. And I learned a lot of what I, carry with me today regarding employee engagement comes from my days at Merit. I worked my way around Merritt's in different business units and then left as the director of HR supporting our motivation business. And then Ross and Berrezzini called and they wanted me to start HR from the ground up. So that's when I moved to Ross and Berrezzini. And when I joined, we were at 190. When I left 6.5 years later, we were at 500 on our way to being over 1,000. And so it was quite an experience. We went through probably 7 acquisitions. Every acquisition is different. They all are different people, different whys, different things that are important to them. And so that was a really exciting time for me. When I left Russ and Berrezzini, I was actually in the CAO role where I oversaw IT operation and HR. So that was a wonderful experience, getting really close to the business, getting close to the financials of the business, and really learning all the ins and outs of that. So then I left, did a short stint for a while at a digital marketing firm, remote first organization. It was a great company, but then I really knew that I wanted that acquisition piece again. When Nimble reached out, I knew that would be a great fit for me, bring all my experiences together to create a best in class HR department team and to really focus on the employee experience. So here we are today.
I love it. You have such a diverse background, and I want to hit on a couple of the different topics you brought up going through your background. First, I want to ask, just hearing you talk about and share, I love that you started at McDonald's and kind of that experience and saying that you learned everything you needed to know about people at McDonald's. I would love for you to expand on that just a little bit, because I think a lot of times people underestimate the value of those first roles and the lessons that we get in those early career type of positions and how that contributes to us down the road and the value that brings us as leaders as we move throughout different roles in our lives. So I'm just curious, what are some of the important things that you learned about people in that role at McDonald's?
A lot of different elements of it. I think everybody who worked there had a story. They all had a unique why of what brought them there. So that's like more on like the coworker team side of things. When I eventually had direct reports, it was like really understanding how to motivate people so that way we can all accomplish a common goal. But I think also the client service aspect of it. And I approach my role today as an HR leader, as a servant leader. I am here to serve and support the business and to make sure that all of our employees have everything that they need to be successful in their role and that they have the support and everything that they need. And I think that comes back to whenever you're working in fast food, like you need to move quick. You have time goals that you have to achieve. And it is chaotic around the lunch rush and the dinner rush. Like those were the most chaotic times. And you have people mad, their stresses are high, and like you have to be successful in that environment. So learning how to navigate that and the different challenges really taught me a lot about interacting with people, calming down customers who are really upset, and how to try to find that middle ground and make sure that we have a win-win overall. A lot of that translates over into HR because we're here to solve all the problems of the people, right? And to support the business so that way they can focus on the thing that they do really well. So yeah.
I think that's so interesting as you were talking about the lunch rushes and the unhappy customers. That was one of the questions we always asked in interviews in my past. Give me an example of dealing with an unhappy customer. And anybody who'd ever been in a service industry, of course, had that experience. And I think those opportunities are really valuable for helping people to cultivate their skills for how to deal with or be empathetic or understanding and navigate those tough conversations with customers where you don't want it to escalate and you have to get through it and all of the things. So I think those are just really great and examples of where it doesn't matter really what role you're in, you can still find a why and you can still learn and make a difference as you're growing and developing, which I think is really powerful. You talked about your time in doing lots of different acquisitions and in having to navigate those and the challenges that go with those. And we talked about a little bit that the difficulty with communicating or the challenges that come with communications. And I've been through my fair share of acquisitions and mergers. And so I know that those are incredibly delicate times and situations for having effective communications, for ensuring that you are moving through or communicating the right things, especially when there's things that are confidential and sometimes they can be shared and sometimes they can't. Tell us just a little bit about some of the things that can go wrong in these processes with respect to communication. What are some of the things that you've seen really be a challenge or be a struggle when you're trying to communicate through these acquisitions or mergers or different type of corporate transitions?
I think a couple of things. I think one, it starts with diligence and planning and making sure like the communication tools, the platform, right? Once we go live, like the integration part is really important because that's going to set the stage for after it's announced, after we start bringing the employees together, those communication mechanisms have to be in place. Some things I've seen is like emails, something as simple as an email. How is that integrated? Are they on our network? Are we going to be able to collaborate? But what's the messaging? That's why you need a good plan and strategy and mapping out the different phases of coming together as an organization, bringing in your HR team and your IT team as early as possible is really important because then we can start thinking about and mapping out all the things, the equipment, what's going to happen there, the communication pieces. And again, HR and IT have to be in lockstep because so much overlap there and collaboration takes place. That partnership is really important. And then also working with the leaders, the key stakeholders for both entities, building that relationship, building that trust. I start doing that day one. Who can I work with on your team to build that partnership and that trust is really important so we can share information and we can collaborate effectively because their people are going to be looking to them on how they react and respond for leaders on both sides, right? It's like a parent with a child. They always say that employees always look to their leaders to see how they act, how they respond in these situations. So we need to first make sure that our leadership team and those key stakeholders are all on board. We're singing off the same song sheet. We're aligned. We're communicating effectively for everything to go smoothly as we transition. Once everything's signed on the dotted line and we bring the employees together, or we start bringing them in, effectively overly communicating. I like to be there live on go live day because I want them to see my face. I want to talk to them. I want to understand what their concerns are. I bring my strong partners with me. 401k provider, your benefits. That's the thing they care about most on day one. What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my benefits, my pay? Those are the most critical things that they care about on day one. So it's important that I am there to answer those questions, field those questions, and then to follow up after that. I learned in my marketing 101 class, somebody has to hear a message 5 times. So we make sure that we are communicating the same message 5 times, right? Here's what you need to do. We have an email communication or just overall communication plan and strategy that we follow after the acquisition. And we put it in bite-sized chunks because there's just so much information. So we'll tell them, we're going to tell you everything, every step of the way, what you need to have that integration.
So what's interesting there, or with what you're talking about, is if you're communicating things 5 times, some people might say that's over communicating. I think you even used that word of effectively over communicating. Is there a scenario where we truly over communicate, or do you think that's a pretty rare occurrence?
I think it's a pretty rare occurrence because I think there's a lot of assumptions, like they should know this. But I think you have to come from the lens to even not. People can miss things. People are busy. People don't read emails, especially if they're long emails. Like they got to be bullet to the point. You bold the important things. So I think that things do get missed. And I really don't think there is a scenario where you can over communicate.
It's interesting from a neuroscience perspective, which is my area. We are constantly filtering information and deciding what we're going to pay attention to and not pay attention to because there's too much information coming at us. The common statistic that people use is that there's 11 million bits of information coming at us, but we can only process a small portion of that. And so when we think about that, and we think about that in the context of these different scenarios and people communicating, even if they've heard something, it doesn't mean that they have internalized or processed that communication. And so I like what you said about 5 times and that it's hard to over communicate because you have to almost assume that maybe the first 3 times they don't even recognize it. They don't even really hear it or internalize it. And I kind of joke sometimes my husband will say, "You're not listening to our kids, right? You're not listening. You're not listening to us." I'm like, "Oh, they're listening. They're just not hearing you. They're not internalizing what you're saying and remembering that's what you communicated or that's what you said." And I don't think we as adults are all that different. We might hear it, but we may not internalize it. And so that creates that requirement for that repeated communication. Have you ever seen a communication just go really wrong? Have you been in a scenario where something, and you don't have to give specifics around when or who, but a scenario where you saw communication just really cause challenges or problems?
I have multiple times. And that's why I think you have to be and it's an art, right? Because you want to be concise and you want it to be meaningful and impactful, but there could be different cues in there that other people pick up or interpret in a different way. So, what I like to do and what I've learned to do is I will socialize a message with the most challenging person or somebody who I know is going to give me honest feedback or who I think may interpret it differently to ensure that message will be received or to better understand how, maybe there's a better way to communicate this because I have learned when messages have been either misinterpreted or it wasn't clear enough, or sometimes folks read in between the lines if things aren't said. So making sure like that is clarified too, and just looking at it holistically, because I think we have a lens of how we see something and our intention. but we don't realize how it's landing and how it's being received. So again, that's why I like to pull in a couple different perspectives, have a couple different folks look at it to make sure that they're good. Another thing I like to do when I'm sending out any kind of change management communication, I have a cascade approach that I've used. So first I'll use the executive team, or depending on where I sit in the organization, in my current role, executive team, then our vice president, then our directors, then our people leaders, then the rest of the people. So we're all hearing the same message and we're all aligned. And so when it's pushed out, there shouldn't be any surprises or changes. And we're all prepared to answer them.
I absolutely love that. And I really love what you just said about the reading through the lines, what we're not saying, and that we do all have quite literally a lens through which we see the world because we have our life experiences that create that lens, that create what we pay attention to and don't pay attention to. And then how we internalize it, right? How we interpret that interaction or that communication and internalize it. And so I think that's really powerful and impactful to get that variety of perspectives so you understand how different people might receive the information that you're sharing and what they might not hear in a communication if you leave it out or if you don't address it or if you don't communicate about it and the conclusions that they would draw from it. And your cascade approach is just fantastic. I love that you do that because that eliminates a lot of the potential conflicting stories, right? That one executive saying one thing, another one saying something different. So what people then hear is in conflict and now they don't trust the communications coming in.
Absolutely. And I think too, when it comes to communicating in different scenarios, like you think about acquisitions, or I've changed jobs twice in the past year. Wasn't my plan, but it happened. But over communicating, like getting back to that, like in the beginning, I don't think lesson learned for me, because you're new and you're like, I don't want to be annoying, but you need to be, and making sure that you're proactively communicating, you're proactively reaching out, you're building those relationships, making sure that your peers are aligned and they know what you're doing and that you are making sure they're in the loop on things. So again, that's something that I don't think anybody can do enough of, especially if you're new in a role. Regardless, even with my own team, I have one-on-ones with them. We have weekly team meeting. I think communication is just so important.
Every leadership book, every thought leader out there talks about communication. It's not a surprise to say that communication is really important. There's super expensive change management companies and programs and things all really centered around communication and managing people through changes. Why do you think, despite knowing all of this, it remains such a challenge or such an issue that we're still struggling with?
I think it's a number of things. I've read all the books too. Rockefeller Habits is a great one. Five Dysfunctions of a Team. They're all great. It's executing, implementing, and making sure that like it's top of mind with everything that we do. And I think that the bigger you get, the harder it gets. The more everybody's busy. I have never worked in an organization where it's not busy. There's not a lot going on. We move really fast, and I think that's part of it. I think also we think and assume that people know things that they don't, or that they should know, but they don't. And so we really have to break it down and make sure that they really know and understand and fill in the gap. For example, when somebody's coming on board, one thing that I see happen, there's such a gap between new hire orientation and then them actually in the role. Like to me, in every place I've worked, that's been the gap. And it's that handoff piece. And it's like how you do your job, how you actually do, and really having a structured onboarding game plan that says, okay, you're not just going to meet with this person, but here are the topics you're going to cover. Here's how it relates to the job description. I was just doing this morning. So it's like top of mind, right? Here's the job description. Here's what who you're going to meet with. This is how they're going to help you be successful in your role. Again, another form of communication to really help bridge that gap as an example, because I think we assume that somebody knows, but they might not, because we've been in the role forever. We know it, but it's also thinking that next step on how we collaborate, how do we work together, thinking about the other person, putting ourselves in their shoes to think about maybe what could they be experiencing. One thing too I see, and I coach my team on this and I challenge myself with this. Whenever I respond to an email, I always think like taking it one step further, right? Like I'm not just going to, if I don't have the answer, then I will partner them with somebody who does versus saying, go to that person. So it's that extra level and taking that next step to make it more effective.
I love that, and it reminds me of a prior episode we did with an organization called Largely around that onboarding piece, around that gap in time, and they're a startup company and Allison, their chief strategy and people officer, was sharing with us their technology is focused on basically the experience of both in the recruitment process, but then between offer letter and onboarding and even through onboarding of nurturing that person. And they create basically like marketing campaigns almost to those new hires so that they're regularly getting communications. Hey, one more week until you start. Check out this video about the role you're going to start. And then here's a video about what it's like to spend time or go to lunch with people or whatever the topics are. So they create this experience where people are now getting excited about coming into the organization. I just love what they do. And I think it really fits with what you're talking about of that gap where we have a tendency not to communicate and the impact that can have, or the lack of opportunity to make an impact that we're not taking advantage of in those different types of situations. But absolutely, I think that those are great examples of where it's really important to find and identify how to bring people the information that they need when they most need it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you seen any other strategies or challenges where, one of the things that often comes up with respect to communication is trust and whether people actually trust the communications that they're getting? And I think we went through an interesting time with COVID of lots of communication, or maybe we trusted certain communications more, and whether that's still the case or has it changed? What are you seeing with respect to that?
Yeah, COVID, we could have a whole discussion on, again, times of change, over communicate, but I think it starts with building the relationship and building the trust, right? Like with the people and making sure that there's trusted, reliable sources of information whenever you're communicating, like validating it. That's really important, especially what we learned from COVID. There's different viewpoints, different opinions. What is the source of truth? And where are we going for guidance when everyone was like flying blind through that whole thing, which was interesting. But I think, again, like when I think about new team members, building relationships, I really focus on building that trust. One thing that I like to do is I like to ask folks how they like to communicate. How do you like to get feedback? What is the best way for us to work together? Because I think that helps, again, with the trust of leaning in, I'm meeting you where you are. But then also, as we move forward, we can work better together and we can share information in a more collaborative way. But I think it's the trust with the people that's important within your team, within your peers, within the organization. But then as you're communicating, making sure that those sources of truth are validated. I think that's really important.
So, how do you, as a leader, if somebody's listening to this, how do you cultivate that trust? How do you maybe know if you've got it? And what do you do if you don't? What are the things you need to do to get that trust with the people you're communicating with?
I think it's a couple of different things. I think being present as much as you can, if you're remote, being on video, but really in my role, getting to know and understand the business and getting to know and understand as people. Whenever I start a new role, and even in past lives when I was in the role, I would go travel to our locations and I would spend time with them. That meant so much to people that I would take the time out to spend time with them and to understand what's going on. And just again, to listen, just to take time and listen. And even if I can't fix whatever their issue was, at least they know that I cared and that I tried. And that goes such a long way. It's just really spending time with people. And it's not a whole lot of time, but just knowing that you're there and that you're available. Following up with a sense of urgency, making sure that they feel that they're heard and that, you are working to help them. I think that goes such a long way to build that trust. Trust is not given at all. It takes a lot for it to be earned. When I go into every situation, every new opportunity with, I know what I'm in for because it's going to take a long time to build this and it can be lost so easily. I don't take it for granted once it's earned, but I think it's a lot of that over communicating, delivering on your promises, stretching and kind of meeting people sometimes where they're at so then they can get more comfortable figuring out again how they like to be communicated with. Because I don't want to bother people and I don't want to be in their way and in their face. But at the same time, sometimes you just have to figure out what is that rhythm to make sure that everybody's aligned.
And I think when you talk about that, making that time for those conversations, I think to add to that is a willingness to engage or share in those conversations, right? There's always a general distrust when a leader won't tell you anything about themselves, or they'll never admit a mistake, or they won't be real in the conversations that you have. That makes it more difficult to connect with them, more difficult to feel as though they're being authentic or genuine or real in terms of that conversation. And if you think about the 5 dysfunctions you mentioned earlier, the base level, right? If you want to have trust, you have to have vulnerability. If there's not vulnerability, then you're not going to get to that trust. And so that's a really important component of building up that trust, and then doing that consistently. You can't just do it one time and expect that people are now going to trust you. You've got to earn it, like you talked about. It takes time and an ongoing showing of intention to do the right thing or communicate in that way. The other type of communication I think that often becomes problematic, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier, was when we're giving feedback or we're receiving feedback. And that often goes sideways or doesn't happen at all. I'm sure you've seen this. Most HR people will talk about how by the time someone's coming to HR, they've let something go on for such a long time. They've not addressed something that's been an issue. And those types of challenges should never be a surprise, right? Difficult conversations should never come as a surprise. And yet they do all of the time. What do you think is contributing to that challenge, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, it's funny. I thought about this on my way home last night because it happens very often. And in HR, we see it all the time. Everywhere I've ever worked, it's the same thing. And I think that it comes down to it's an uncomfortable conversation. It is uncomfortable. It is not comfortable to tell somebody to give them critical feedback or to talk about something that's awkward. And so I always say you have to get uncomfortable to get comfortable and you have to practice it. That's why we use like talk tracks with our team here to script out the conversation to make sure that we feel comfortable. I'm happy to do role plays with them. I'm happy to be there, whatever we can do, because I think that, I put myself in the employee's shoes a lot of times. If that was me, at least I would want to know. And I coach managers the same way. If it put yourself in that person's situation, they would want to know versus by saying, you know what, it's just not working out. They want the feedback as painful as it is sometimes to deliver. It's helpful and the employee needs it and they want it and it's fair to them at the end of the day. So whenever I'm coaching leaders on this, I always start with that and I always lead with like intention, right? Like my intention is I want to give you this feedback because I care and I want to see you be successful. And our role as their roles as leaders is that we give feedback to our employees to help them be successful in their role. And if we're not, then we're really not doing our role as leaders. And here's some uncomfortable feedback that I need to share with you today. And I want you to understand the intention behind this because I want to see you be successful. And that kind of helps it be a little bit more or less uncomfortable because you care about them and you're coming from a good place. Because if you didn't give them that feedback, then they wouldn't know. A coworker always used to tell me, it's like having spinach in your teeth, right? And nobody tells you. And it's like you're walking around and you're not doing something right. And and it really hurts the employee because they're like, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. You're telling me that I'm doing a great job, yet I'm not getting promoted. I'm not getting to the next level. And so they really do want to know, as painful as it can be and awkward during that conversation, everybody's better for it in the end.
So what's interesting is that when it comes to, and I agree with you that people have this discomfort. And so then the question I always ask then is, okay, where's the discomfort coming from? What is it that is really preventing you from taking action? One of the things that we train on in some of our neuroscience-based performance practices is that action comes from our gut intelligence, from the gut brain, if you will. And so when we're not taking action, we have to check in with, okay, what's going on? And I was coaching the CEO who's since retired, but he'd been a CEO for 30 plus years. And he'd always struggled to give feedback. He'd had multiple issues where he had really big challenges in people and waited just way too long to address those issues. And so we were doing this neuroscience based coaching technique, and I asked him, where does he feel that? So when he thinks about giving someone that type of feedback, those situations, what does he feel in his body? And he immediately felt like this desire to push back from the table and move away and not deal with it. Like his body was like, let's go somewhere else. And so then we dug into that going through this process. And we ended up discovering was that as the owner of the company, he was afraid that if he gave that feedback, the person might leave and it might hurt the other employees. There was also some elements of hurting the relationship, wanting the person to like him. And there were some limiting beliefs there around needing to be liked or needing to have people like you and want your feedback, things like that. And he was afraid that it would hurt the relationship. And I think what I've discovered as I've worked with different leaders is that ends up being the case, that there's something in the past with respect to the leader that keeps them from wanting to have those types of conversations. And until they deal with that underlying motivation or counter motivation, it becomes something that is hard to do rather than just something else they have to do, rather than just another task that they have to accomplish, irregardless of how they feel internally about it. So I'm curious, have you ever had similar experiences with leaders where you've had to coach them through getting to that point of being able to deliver that feedback or have those conversations and seen them overcome that challenge?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think once they get, again, the messaging, once they have the script and the message, they get more comfortable with it. And again, the why behind it and understanding it's really for that person's benefit. And I think, again, you talked about liking somebody and being liked. And I like to be liked too. I do. But at the same time, it's my role because I care. I want to see you be successful. And that's why I'm giving you this feedback. Because if I would want somebody to tell me, if somebody really cared about me, they would tell me. And a lot of parallels to being a parent. It's because I love you. Because I love you that I'm making you do this, right? And it's the same thing with employees, right? I love you and I care about you. And this is why I'm sharing this with you. So I think, again, using those techniques has been helpful to help them get in that mindset to where they are more comfortable and through that lens as they approach those conversations.
And I love what you focused on there and highlighted in terms of intention, because I think often that can be a determining factor. If my intention is to make you feel bad because you made a mistake, or my intention is because I'm mad that you didn't get the work done, if my intention isn't in your best interest, then it's probably not an effective feedback conversation. So if we can get clear on our intention of what we want the outcome of the conversation to be, it changes the nature of the conversation, right? And so if we're focused less on how we're wanting to respond or what we think should have happened or what went right or wrong, and more on how do we help them understand for the future for what they're going to do next, it just shifts the nature of what you're communicating as well as how you're communicating, right?
Yeah. And one thing too, I thought about earlier, we talked about communication, kind of same concept, but I always like for leaders to include examples of what, again, communication, miscommunication, misinterpretation. Examples are really important because the truth is always somewhere in the middle, I always say, but there's two perspectives of how something happened. There's always two perspectives. And maybe the manager didn't give clear enough direction. Maybe the employee didn't understand what the clear outcome or expectation was. So whenever we are delivering feedback, I think it's really important that we provide examples with numbers and metrics to show this is what was expected. This is what the outcome was. So they can clearly see and understand what that gap was. And then here's the coaching moving forward. This is what I expect to see moving forward. Those kinds of elements to help get alignment to bridge those communication gaps too.
I think that's incredibly helpful and valuable feedback and advice for anybody who's looking at how to do this successfully. And speaking and in the same space of communication, there's probably no bigger challenge, arguably, with respect to communication when it comes to technology change. And technology is changing just so fast all the time. It's incredible the rate at which we're having to adapt to new technology. And you and I share a unique experience in that we both had responsibility for both the people and the technology functions for both HR and IT. Tell me a little bit about your experience managing both those functions and what, if anything, you discovered were maybe some of the benefits or the drawbacks of having both of those functions, if there were any.
Yeah, I think so. I'm an HR professional. I've grown up an HR professional. I don't have an IT background, but I learned very quickly. And so when I stepped into that role, I leveraged my network, CIOs who I'd worked with in past lives, became part of networking group, women in IT networking groups I'm still part of today because they're wonderful groups, but learned everything that I absolutely could at a high level so I could know and understand and I could be a good leader. And I think leadership skills across the board can apply. And same thing for like IT and HR function, a lot of process, streamlining, efficiency, those types of things were really our focus because what I had done in our HR team is we had streamlined everything by leveraging technology, eliminating all manual processes. So that was really my goal with our IT team was to help streamline, eliminate manual processes, working with our IT leader who was very strong technically, very strong technically. He's a great leader, great person. I think he just needed that coach to help him think through different scenarios and situations. And we had a very good partnership together. Again, had to earn trust and respect because day one, I'm not an IT leader, like a trained IT professional. But we had a very strong partnership in working with that team through that, really understanding what their challenges were. And there's a lot of similarity like I said, leveraging technology to streamline processes. And there's so much opportunity across the board. Compliance is big on both sides of it. You have like your SOC 2 compliance, and then you have all your HR compliance. So a lot of similarities. How can we streamline? How can we use vendors and partners so we're not manually doing those tasks?
The intersection of people and technology is really the future of work in general, is how do we effectively leverage these massive leaps in technology that we now have access to as the people that are required to use, make decisions about, integrate, figure out how to leverage these technologies in terms of executing the work that we do. And so now more than ever, that intersection of those two areas become just incredibly important, and making sure that they're really lockstep. You talked about that with respect to acquisitions, but I think that can be the case with respect to a lot of different scenarios within the organization when you're making big technology changes, when you're trying to get everybody set up with technology, when you're trying to impact performance with technology. Being able to have those two functions, even if they aren't under the same person, making sure that there's a lot of collaboration and strong relationships between them, I think is just incredibly important to the success of your technology implementations for sure, and your people's performance in the organization. What do you think about that?
No, I absolutely do. And I think it makes making sure it's the right technology because there's a lot of like sexy technologies out there. Oh, this would be great. And you could be like a kid in a candy store. Oh, we should do this and this. So I think it's like really understanding too what's the people impact? What's the ROI? What's the business impact? What problem are we trying to solve? Right? What problem are we trying to solve? And how is this going to make us better, more efficient, and all those things? That's what I think about before we go down to implement a new technology path. Like it's got to make sense. The ROI piece of it, I always say, is the juice worth the squeeze? And then what are we going to see out of this? And we can start measuring tangible results as a result of implementing. And then again, making sure our people, how are we communicating? Are we going to use it? 'Cause they don't know how to use a system. If it's too difficult to use, they're not going to do it. If it makes their life any harder, change is hard, they're not going to do it. So making sure all of those elements are fleshed out makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, and I think I'm laughing a little bit because when it comes to you're absolutely right. If it's too hard, they don't do it. And often, especially in the context of performance or HR related technology, I hear people talk about, I got to get the right technology. I got to get the right system that does things the right way. And we've talked a lot about communication, and one of my responses there is typically, I don't care how great your system is or how many bells and whistles it has. If your people don't know how to have effective performance conversations, if they don't know how to engage and they don't know how to do that in an effective way, then it's not going to make a difference. Whether all that stuff's documented and put into some system somewhere, that it really has to start with skills development rather than a technology solving the problem. And so I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's something that really becomes apparent when you're doing both sides of the coin. When you're understanding that technology is cool and it can bring a lot of value, but you also understand people and that people aren't going to just use it for the sake of using it, that there has to be value or they have to understand how it's contributing in some way in order to be able to use it effectively. And the truth is with technology, especially with AI and machine learning and what's available now is that we can do almost anything we want with technology today. So the limiting factor is really going to end up being the performance of our people and how we can manage them or support them to be able to use the technology to create those positive outcomes or those positive results.
Yeah, and it's
So
the behaviors too, right? Like I think about like you said something, I think let's wait for the system, like to implement our new performance review process. And we're in that boat right now. Like we're implementing a new HRS system with a performance review process that will be more streamlined electronic. But the problem is that we need to get those behaviors established now. So I don't want to wait for a new system. I want those behaviors in place now to where we're starting to get those down to a fine science so it's like second nature and we feel comfortable. So then like the tool is like the added benefit, but it's really the conversation that we're focused on.
yeah, because then people want the tool, right? Now
Yeah.
they're like, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if there was a place to put this? Or wouldn't it be great if I had this record about this thing?" Because they want that now, because they want it to be streamlined versus so they're asking for it versus they're being told, "Here's what you have to do."
Yeah. And it's a journey, right? This doesn't happen overnight. It's change and change is hard, man. We're moving their cheese. I totally get it. But it takes time and repetition. Again, 5 times.
One of the things with change that really, again, from the neuroscience perspective, that really opened my eyes was that quite literally our brains and bodies are designed to conserve energy to keep us alive. So our brains and bodies, the less we can change, the more we can use the same neural pathways in our brains that tell us what to do and how to do things, the more energy we conserve that can be used to outrun the tiger. But we don't have those scenarios anymore. And recognizing that we have the capacity for infinite change, that we actually have the ability to completely rewire and change our brains in any way that we want. We're not limited by that, but our natural biological design is to resist that change. So it does take effort and intention and creating that awareness and that desire for the change before implementing technology or whatever the change might be, right?
No, absolutely.
So, one of the questions I love to ask all my guests, and I think we could talk about some of these topics all day if we wanted to, but I love to just always ask if you were to want to bring something to your business right now, if there was something that you could bring to support your business, to bring value to your business right now, what is the thing that would help your business the most in its current state?
I think our current business, but I think this applies honestly anywhere I ever worked, is finding the right people for the right roles. That talent is so critical and important, making sure that we have the right talent in the right role. And then those feeder opportunities and making sure that the employer branding piece, telling our story, telling who we are as an organization and sharing our culture, something we're working on. But I think that's really important. Every organization that I've worked for, there's always been a really cool story there that we don't tell enough because that helps with bringing in candidates and bringing in talent because That's like the why and the people connection to the organization. People don't want a job. They want a home. They want a place that they feel like they belong and that they're connected to that's fun and of course purposeful and of course meeting their career goals and giving them an opportunity and all those things. So that's something that we're working on right now is telling our great story and finding those applicant pools so that way we have that people are lining up outside the door wanting to come work here. That's nirvana and what we're working towards.
I think that is always at the crux of making an organization the best organization it can be is both finding that talent and then figuring out what to do with it and making sure you're helping support your talent to create those results. And that is where that communication comes in and it's just so critical. So, as we wrap up today's episode, we've talked about a lot of really, I think, valuable insights and strategies around people and communication, and especially as it relates to change and technology. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners as we wrap up today's episode?
I think, and just one final thought, piggybacking on our last thought, but also keeping your people, your great people is so important. And it's got to be a focus. It's got to be top of mind priority, whether it be checking in with them, making sure that they're at a good place, making sure that they're fulfilled and they feel valued. And I think that is the most important thing. Make sure your rock stars know that they're rock stars and that they, again, that they're fulfilled, they're happy, and they have everything they need. I think that's really the key to keeping people and retention. And that's a big hot topic right now. But it's I think it's basic, but it's not rocket science. It's not neuroscience. It's not that hard. I'm sure there's a lot of neuroscience that goes into that, but it's really about feeling valued.
I think what you would find is that underneath all of those core concepts, like feeling valued, is a neurobiological reason for why that's critical, for why that is an essential element or an essential contributing factor to successfully retaining people. And that when you apply a performance based approach that is based in what is best for humans, for us and how we operate and how we exist, that you not only create exponentially greater performance results that every company out there has already researched and documented. Those with the highest levels of engagement see just much more significant results in terms of business performance, but you also see better outcomes for the people. And that is really what contributes to that retention. If things are going good and I feel good and I am happy and things are going well, I'm not entertaining phone calls or looking for another job. And so I think your point there about retention and about creating that experience that really supports people in a way that makes it so invaluable to them that they wouldn't ever leave is the key to having that successful retention and having the organization that people stay rather than having to deal with the constant turnover. I want to thank you, Trista, so much for coming on today and sharing all of your experience and wisdom and insights. And it's been just such a fantastic conversation. And I'm so glad that you were able to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I love this topic. I love HR, all things people. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, as always, just remember to always keep evolving, keep growing, keep looking at how you can continue to live your very best life. Have a wonderful week, and we'll be back again next week with another episode.